Liberation comes to Korea without warning and without instructions. On 15th August 1945, the Japanese authority collapsed almost overnight, ending 35 years of colonial rule. Across the peninsula, church bells ring, crowds gather, and forbidden flags appear in public for the first time in a generation. Relief is real and deeply felt. Yet beneath it lies a quieter realization. Power has vanished faster than it can be replaced. For decades, the Japanese colonial state has controlled nearly every layer of Korean life policing: courts, transport, food distribution, and labor. When Japan surrenders, that system does not hand itself over. It withdraws in fragments. Some officials flee. Others wait in their offices, unsure who will arrive to replace them. Trains stall. Telegraph offices fall silent. Warehouses sit unguarded. Liberation arrives not as an orderly transition, but as a vacuum. Into that vacuum, Koreans move quickly. Across cities, towns, and rural districts, local groups form to maintain order and keep daily life functioning. These people's committees emerge spontaneously, drawing on networks of labor organizers, teachers, religious leaders, and long-suppressed independence activists. Their goals are immediate and practical: prevent looting, manage food supplies, reopen schools, and ensure that Japanese authority does not simply reassert itself under a different name. In many places, these committees take control of police stations, sometimes persuading Japanese officers to remain temporarily under Korean supervision to prevent chaos. Grain stocks are inventoried. Local militias are organized to guard infrastructure. For a brief moment, the mechanics of governance are being rebuilt from the ground up, not by foreign decree, but by local initiative. By late August, efforts are made to coordinate these committees at a national level. A provisional Korean authority is declared in Seoul, presenting itself as an interim government until independence can be formally recognized. It lacks armed force and international recognition, but it reflects a widespread assumption shared by ordinary Koreans, that liberation will naturally lead to self-rule. That assumption soon encounters the limits of Allied planning. Korea has been liberated not by one power, but by two armies approaching from opposite directions. Soviet forces advance southward after defeating Japanese units in Manchuria. American planners, facing the sudden end of the Pacific War, scramble to decide how and where Japan's surrender on the peninsula will be accepted. Korea, long treated as a colonial afterthought, becomes an urgent logistical problem rather than a prepared political project. On 10th August 1945, with little time for deliberation, United States officials proposed dividing responsibility for Korea along the 38th parallel. The line is selected hastily, drawn across a National Geographic map in Washington. It is intended as a temporary administrative boundary, not a border and expedient way to prevent Soviet forces from occupying the entire peninsula before American troops can arrive. No Koreans are consulted. The decision is framed as technical, not political. Yet when Soviet authorities accept the proposal, the line begins to acquire meaning. What is meant to be provisional gains weight through agreement, movement, and the simple fact of time. On the ground, awareness of the division spreads slowly and unevenly. In many districts, people's committees continue operating without knowing which occupying authority will soon appear or whether one will appear at all. In the north, Soviet troops enter key cities in late August, moving with clear command structures and defined objectives. In the south, American forces are still days away, delayed by shipping constraints and redeployment priorities elsewhere in the Pacific. This gap matters. In the absence of Allied forces, Korean administrators must make difficult choices. They negotiate with departing Japanese officials to ensure that power stations remain running and food stores are not destroyed. These negotiations later attract controversy, but at the time, they are driven by urgency. The alternative is collapse, empty markets, armed disorder, and uncontrolled reprisals. Liberation, in these weeks, is neither peaceful nor uniformly violent. It is uneven, uncertain, and fragile. Some communities manage the transition with relative calm. Others experience shortages, score settling, and fear. Everywhere, the same question hangs unanswered. Who will decide Korea's future? When Soviet forces establish authority north of the 38th parallel, they move quickly to replace Japanese command with their own structures, while allowing Korean organizations to operate under supervision. In the south, anticipation builds around the arrival of American troops, seen by some as protectors, and by others as another external power whose intentions remain unclear. What unites these experiences is the absence of a single, coherent plan for Korea itself. Liberation has come faster than policy. Decisions made in distant capitals now begin to shape realities on the ground, even as Koreans attempt to assert control over their own lives. By early September, the peninsula is still officially one country, but it is already being administered as two. A line drawn for convenience has not yet hardened into a border, but it is no longer abstract. As American forces prepare to land and Soviet authorities consolidate their zone, the space for a unified Korean transition narrows. The vacuum of August 1945 does not last long. It is filled not by independence, but by occupation, and by a division that begins quietly, without ceremony, before most people fully understand what it will mean. What began as a line on paper soon began to shape lives. In August 1945, the 38th parallel existed only as a proposal, a hurried solution to an urgent problem created by Japan's sudden surrender. It is not announced to Koreans as a border, nor imagined as permanent. It has no fences, no checkpoints, no physical markers on the ground. Yet as armies move and administrations take form, the line stops being abstract. It becomes real through action. In the north, Soviet forces arrive first. Advancing south after defeating Japanese armies in Manchuria, Red Army units enter Korean cities in late August with clear authority and defined command structures. Japanese military personnel are disarmed. Colonial officials are removed from power. Soviet commanders secure railways, ports, and power stations, ensuring that the machinery of the state does not collapse along with Japanese rule. The Soviet presence is immediate and organized. Patrols appear in city streets. Military headquarters are established in former Japanese administrative buildings. Orders are issued quickly and enforced consistently. For civilians, there is little uncertainty about who now holds authority. Japanese rule ends decisively, replaced by a new occupying power that moves with confidence and direction. South of the 38th parallel, the situation unfolds far more slowly. American forces are designated to accept Japan's surrender there, but they do not arrive until weeks later. Shipping shortages, redeployment priorities, and the speed of Japan's collapse all contribute to the delay. In the meantime, Southern Korea remains in a state of suspended transition. Japanese authority has collapsed, but no Allied authority has yet taken its place. During this interval, the Korean People's Committees continue to operate. They regulate markets, guard infrastructure, and attempt to maintain order. Their authority is improvised and uneven, but in many places it prevents chaos. Yet uncertainty hangs over everything. It is widely understood that foreign forces will soon arrive, and no one knows whether these locally organized structures will be accepted or swept aside. When American forces finally landed at Incheon on 8 September 1945, they did so as occupiers, not as political liberators in the sense many Koreans had expected. Authority is assumed under the U.S. military government in Korea, USAMGIK. Military proclamations are issued, first in English and then translated. Governance shifts abruptly from Korean-led emergency institutions to direct military rule. American officers inherit responsibility for governing more than 20 million people. Few speak Korean. Most have limited familiarity with the country's political history. They rely heavily on existing administrative structures, many of which are still staffed by Koreans who served under Japanese rule. US officials see this continuity as practical. For many Koreans, it feels like a betrayal of the promise of liberation. The contrast between the two zones sharpens quickly. In the north, Soviet authorities dismantle Japanese command, while allowing Korean organizations to function under supervision. People's committees are evaluated, reshaped, and selectively incorporated. Those deemed cooperative are retained. Those deemed uncooperative are removed. Korean participation is encouraged, but only within boundaries defined by the occupiers. In the South, the American military government takes a harder line. Suspicious of local political groups, particularly those with leftist or nationalist leanings, USAMGIK refuses to recognize the Korean Provisional Authority declared in Seoul. People's committees are viewed not as civic stopgaps, but as potential sources of instability. Orders are issued to dissolve them and replace local governance with military administration. For many Koreans, this comes as a shock. Liberation had been understood as the end of foreign control, not its continuation under another flag. The refusal to recognize Korean self-organized institutions breeds frustration and confusion, especially among those who had worked to prevent disorder during the power vacuum. Authority, once again, flows from outside. Meanwhile, the 38th parallel begins to harden through practice. Movement across it becomes regulated. Soviet and American forces coordinate only minimally, maintaining a cautious distance from one another. Each side focuses on consolidating its own zone rather than managing the peninsula as a unified whole. What was intended as a temporary administrative measure now separates two distinct systems of rule. This division is not yet framed as permanent or ideological. The official language still speaks of cooperation, trusteeship, and eventual independence. But daily realities diverge. Policies are made separately. Administrations answer to different command chains. Koreans living only a short distance apart begin experiencing occupation in fundamentally different ways. No Korean plebiscite is held. No unified Korean delegation negotiates the terms of occupation. Decisions about the country's future are discussed in Washington and Moscow, while life on the peninsula is reshaped by military orders issued from foreign headquarters. As weeks pass, temporary arrangements settle into routine. Offices are staffed. Regulations are standardized. Crossing the parallel becomes increasingly difficult. Families find themselves separated. Political groups adapt their strategies to the realities of their zone. Cooperation across the line grows rare. By early autumn 1945, Korea remained legally one nation, but administratively two. The division has not been formalized by treaty, yet it already governs movement, authority, and power. The 38th parallel has not been declared a border, but through daily enforcement, it begins to function as one. By the end of 1945, Korea was no longer divided only by a line on a map. It is divided by experience. North and South remain connected by language, memory, and family ties. But daily life is now shaped by two occupation systems moving in different directions. What began as temporary administration is already producing long-term consequences, evident in how people work, eat, speak, and organize their lives. In the South, the United States Army military government in Korea confronts immediate and complex challenges. The economy it inherits is damaged and distorted by years of colonial extraction and wartime mobilization. Transport networks are disrupted. Industrial production is uneven. Inflation rises rapidly as Japanese currency controls collapse and new systems struggle to take hold. For urban populations long dependent on regulated food supplies, shortages become a constant concern. Food distribution quickly becomes one of the most pressing issues. Rice, already scarce, is unevenly available. Black markets expand as official channels fail to meet demand. American administrators issue price controls and rationing orders, but enforcement is inconsistent. For civilians, Survival increasingly depends on navigating both official regulations and informal networks. Lacking a trained civilian bureaucracy familiar with Korean society, 12 USAMGK relies heavily on existing administrative structures. Japanese officials are removed from senior positions, but their Korean subordinates, clerks, police officers, technicians, and administrators, trained under colonial rule, remain in place. From a military perspective, this continuity provides stability and efficiency. From a civilian perspective, it breeds resentment. To many Koreans, the daily experience of authority feels unchanged, even as the language and symbols of power shift. Political uncertainty deepens these tensions. American officials, increasingly viewing Korea through the lens of emerging global rivalry, interpret left-wing activism as a security threat rather than a domestic political expression. Labor strikes over wages and food shortages are treated not only as economic protests but as signs of ideological subversion. Demonstrations are monitored. Publications face restrictions. Political space narrows as military governance prioritizes order over participation. North of the 38th parallel, Soviet authorities pursue a different course. They move quickly to restructure economic and social systems, dismantling Japanese-owned industries and redistributing land. Large estates are broken up, and farmland is transferred to tenant farmers, without compensation to former owners. For many rural families, this marks a profound change. For the first time, they hold legal claim to the land they cultivate. These reforms generate genuine support, especially in the countryside where land hunger has long fueled resentment. At the same time, political life is tightly managed. Parties and organizations are permitted only within frameworks approved by Soviet administrators. Leadership is carefully selected. Opposition voices are marginalized or suppressed. Stability is achieved, but at the cost of political pluralism. Daily life in the two zones begins to diverge. In the north, land reform reduces rural unrest, but accelerates the flight of landlords, businessmen, and professionals toward the south. In the south, unresolved land ownership, inflation, and labor disputes, fuel strikes, and protests, particularly in industrial areas. Each zone begins absorbing those displaced by the other's policies, reinforcing separation through movement as well as governance. Food shortages affect both sides, but responses differ. In the south, reliance on imports and market controls strains relations between civilians and authorities. In the north, centralized distribution and requisitioning stabilize supplies for some, while increasing state control over daily life. Access to food becomes linked not just to need, but to compliance. Censorship and policing expand across the peninsula, though justified in different language. In the south, repression is framed as necessary to prevent disorder and ideological infiltration. In the north, it is presented as protection of revolutionary transformation. For ordinary Koreans, the effect is similar. Speech narrows, political affiliation becomes risky. Silence increasingly feels safer than participation. By mid-1946, hopes for a unified administrative future begin to fade. Negotiations between Soviet and American authorities stall, weighed down by mutual suspicion and incompatible objectives. Joint commissions convene, issue statements, and dissolve without agreement. Each occupation authority increasingly behaves as though its presence may last far longer than originally promised. The irony is sharp. Both occupations describe themselves as temporary. Both speak of eventual independence. Yet each builds institutions designed for continuity. Schools begin teaching different narratives. Police answer to different command structures. Economic systems evolve along separate lines. A generation starts learning how to live under one system or the other, but not both. What began as liberation has now become divergence. The occupations are no longer merely managing Korea's present. They are shaping two futures. With every reform enacted, every protest suppressed, and every family displaced, The distance between those futures grows, making reunification not impossible, but increasingly costly. In December 1945, Korea's uncertain future is lifted out of the peninsula and placed on a diplomatic table far away. At the Moscow Conference, representatives of the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and China agreed in principle on a solution meant to manage instability rather than resolve it outright. Korea, they decide, will be placed under a joint Allied trusteeship for up to 5 years, followed by independence. On paper, the proposal promises unity. A single provisional Korean government is to be created, guided, and supervised by the occupying powers until it can stand on its own. The arrangement is framed as cooperative and transitional, a way to prevent chaos, limit rivalry, and prepare Korea for sovereignty. To the diplomats involved, trusteeship appears practical, even cautious. When news reaches Korea, however, it lands with force and confusion. For many Koreans, trusteeship feels like a betrayal. Liberation has come after 35 years of colonial rule, and the expectation widely held and deeply felt is immediate independence. The idea that foreign powers will now oversee Korea's political development evokes memories of promises delayed and autonomy denied. The language of trusteeship sounds uncomfortably close to colonial tutelage, no matter how carefully it is explained. Opposition forms rapidly, and it cuts across ideological lines. Right-wing nationalists denounce trusteeship as a continuation of foreign domination. Moderate figures, who had hoped to negotiate independence through diplomacy, find themselves pushed into public resistance. Even left-wing groups, initially more receptive due to Soviet backing of the plan, fracture under intense public pressure. Demonstrations erupt across cities and towns. Students march alongside workers. Veterans of the independence movement return to the streets. Slogans reject both trusteeship and division, insisting that Koreans alone should decide Korea's future. For many participants, the protests are not ideological statements so much as expressions of exhaustion, fatigue, with being governed by distant powers after decades of exclusion. The occupying authorities respond differently to this unrest. In the South, American officials interpret mass demonstrations primarily through a security lens. Large gatherings are viewed not only as expressions of popular will, but also as potential flashpoints in a volatile environment shaped by food shortages, labor unrest, and ideological rivalry. Curfews are imposed. Permits are required for rallies. Police forces are expanded and reinforced, often staffed by personnel carried over from the colonial period. These measures deepen resentment. Protesters interpret repression as proof that the occupation is hardening rather than easing. For American administrators, maintaining order increasingly takes precedence over political accommodation, reinforcing a cycle of mistrust between rulers and ruled. In the North, Soviet authorities promote trusteeship as a necessary and temporary step toward independence, aligning with Moscow's diplomatic position. Public support is organized rather than spontaneous. Messaging is carefully coordinated. Opposition voices are marginalized quickly, sometimes quietly, sometimes forcefully. While large-scale protests are fewer than in the South, the space for dissent narrows rapidly. The promise of a joint United States-Soviet commission to establish a unified provisional government soon encounters difficulty. Talks begin in early 1946, but disagreements surface almost immediately. The central issue is participation, which Korean political organizations should be included in the process. Soviet representatives insist that only groups supporting trusteeship can be considered legitimate partners. American representatives argue for broader inclusion, even of organizations openly opposed to trusteeship, claiming that exclusion will undermine legitimacy. Beneath these procedural disagreements lies a deeper mistrust. Each side suspects the other of shaping the process to secure long-term influence. Meetings stall, recess, and resume without progress. Official statements remain cautiously optimistic, but privately, confidence erodes. The Commission becomes less a forum for cooperation than a symbol of paralysis, proof that even managing division together is proving difficult. Meanwhile, resistance on the ground continues to reshape daily life. In the South, labor strikes spread through railways, factories, and ports, driven by food shortages, wage disputes, and political frustration. Walkouts disrupt already fragile supply lines. American authorities increasingly interpret these actions as coordinated leftist agitation, responding with arrests, surveillance, and tighter controls. In rural areas, frustration takes a different form. Land reform, discussed repeatedly, but delayed in the South, remains unresolved. Tenant farmers wait for a change that does not arrive, while landowners retain influence. In the North, land redistribution has already altered social relations, reinforcing the perception that the two zones are no longer simply governed differently, but structured differently. Trusteeship, intended to delay division, instead accelerates it. As negotiations stall, each occupation authority begins preparing for the possibility that cooperation may fail entirely. Administrative systems deepen. Political allies are cultivated. Temporary measures take on the feel of permanence. For civilians, the atmosphere grows heavier. Public speech becomes risky. Alignments harden. Families measure words carefully, aware that yesterday's opinion may tomorrow be used as evidence. Hope for rapid, unified independence dims, replaced by resignation for some and anger for others. By the end of 1946, trusteeship existed more as a diplomatic concept than a lived reality. Its failure is not yet officially acknowledged, but its momentum has stalled. Korea remains divided, governed separately, and increasingly shaped by decisions made beyond its borders. The promise of unity has not disappeared, but it now competes with a harsher truth. The longer decisions are delayed, the more division becomes normal. What was meant as a bridge toward independence is becoming another point of rupture, one that pushes cooperation closer to confrontation. Order returns to Korea not through consensus, but through force. By 1946, the language of liberation had largely faded from official statements, replaced by concerns about stability, security, and control. Across the peninsula, occupation authorities face mounting unrest and respond by strengthening policing and internal security as the primary tools of governance. In the southern zone, the United States military government in Korea confronts a society under intense strain. Inflation erodes wages faster than relief measures can compensate. Food shortages persist, particularly in cities where dependence on regulated supply systems had been greatest under colonial rule. Workers organize strikes demanding higher pay, access to food, and political recognition. Students and veterans of the independence movement join demonstrations calling for sovereignty and reform. Many of these movements draw on networks formed during the final years of Japanese rule and the chaotic weeks following surrender. They are rooted in lived hardship as much as ideology. To American officials, however, the scale and coordination of unrest increasingly appear not as social distress, but as a threat to security in a region now viewed through the lens of global rivalry. Lacking time, trained alternatives, and local legitimacy, USAMGIK relies heavily on existing police structures. Japanese officers are formally removed, but the institutional framework remains largely intact. Korean police, who served under colonial administration, retain their posts, uniforms, and authority. For the military government, this continuity provides immediate enforcement capacity. For many civilians, it feels like an occupation wearing a familiar face. As protests intensify in 1946, policing becomes more aggressive. Demonstrations are dispersed. Strike leaders are arrested. Newspapers and publications are suspended. Emergency regulations expand police authority, allowing detention without clear judicial oversight. Labor uprisings in ports, railways, and industrial districts are met with force. American advisers justify these measures as necessary to prevent disorder and communist infiltration. On the streets, the distinction between political activism and criminality becomes increasingly blurred. In rural areas, tensions take a different form. Land reform promised repeatedly, but delayed in the South, remains unresolved. Tenant farmers demand redistribution similar to that already taking place north of the 38th parallel. When reforms fail to materialize, frustration turns into resistance. Police raids, evictions, and arrests provoke retaliation. Clashes erupt between security forces, right-wing youth groups, and leftist organizers. Violence spreads unevenly, driven as much by local rivalries and personal grievances as by ideology. The most severe unrest emerges on Jeju Island, where long-standing resentment toward police abuse combines with opposition to separate Southern elections. Beginning in 1948, but rooted in earlier crackdowns, resistance escalates into a sustained uprising. Security forces respond with large-scale operations aimed at restoring control. Villages are emptied. Civilians are displaced. Although details remain contested, the episode leaves deep scars and cements a powerful association between state authority and coercion in the public memory. North of the 38th parallel, policing follows a different structure but reflects a similar logic. Soviet-backed authorities integrate security forces directly into the emerging state apparatus. Political opponents are marginalized, detained, or pressured to flee south. Surveillance becomes routine. Loyalty to the new order is increasingly treated as a prerequisite for participation in public life. Stability is achieved quickly, but dissent is systematically eliminated rather than negotiated. Across both zones, fear becomes a constant undercurrent of daily life. Ordinary Koreans learn to navigate conversations carefully, measuring words and associations. Political identity carries real consequences. Families are divided not only by geography but by affiliation and suspicion. Silence becomes a survival strategy, replacing the open expression that briefly flourished during liberation. By 1947, both occupations could claim success in restoring order. Markets function more predictably. Transportation stabilizes. Large-scale unrest is suppressed. Yet the methods used to achieve this stability leave lasting effects. Policing has shifted from an emergency measure to a defining feature of governance. Security institutions now shape political outcomes, determining who may organize, publish, or lead. The promise of liberation has narrowed into a stark choice: compliance or risk. As security structures harden and dissent is suppressed, the possibility of a negotiated, inclusive future recedes. Stability has been imposed, but reconciliation has not followed. What remains unresolved is whether an order built primarily through coercion can endure, or whether it has merely postponed a deeper reckoning already forming beneath the surface, beyond the reach of the police. By 1947, the language surrounding Korea's future begins to shift. Occupation authorities still speak of independence, but the word unity appears less often, and with less confidence. What now dominates the discussion is legitimacy: who has the right to speak for Korea, and under what authority that right is granted. As cooperation falters, procedure begins to replace consensus. Efforts to manage Korea jointly have reached an impasse. United States, Soviet commissions convene, adjourn, and reconvene without agreement on basic principles. The core question remains unresolved. Should a unified Korean government emerge through broad consultation across the peninsula, or through elections conducted under limited conditions? Each side fears that the other will resort to any means to secure long-term influence. As global tensions harden elsewhere, patience in Korea wears thin. In 1947, the United States turned to the United Nations. The Korean question is brought before the General Assembly, reframed not as a bilateral occupation problem, but as an international responsibility. The resulting proposal creates the United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea. tasked with supervising elections and facilitating the establishment of an independent government. The plan assumes cooperation from all occupying powers. That cooperation does not materialize. Soviet authorities refused to admit the United Nations Commission north of the 38th parallel, arguing that it lacks neutrality and exceeds its mandate. Without access to half the peninsula, the Commission's mission is compromised from the outset. What was intended as a nationwide process becomes, by circumstance, a partial one. Despite these limitations, preparations for elections move forward in the South. American officials argue that continued delay risks instability and radicalization. A functioning Korean government, they contend, is necessary to end military rule and restore sovereignty. Critics, Korean and international, warn that elections conducted in only one zone will formalize division rather than resolve it. The debate is acknowledged, but overtaken by urgency. On 10th May 1948, Koreans in the South went to the polls under United Nations observation. The process unfolds unevenly. In many districts, voting is orderly. In others, it is disrupted by boycotts, protests, and sporadic violence. Turnout varies sharply by region, reflecting both engagement and resistance. For some voters, the election represents a long-denied opportunity to shape their country's future. For others, it feels like a decision imposed under foreign supervision, with consequences they cannot control. The results produce a National Assembly empowered to draft a constitution. Within months, the institutions of a new state begin to take shape. Laws are written, offices staffed, and administrative authority consolidated. The language of temporary governance gives way to that of sovereignty, at least within the southern zone. Military occupation begins transitioning toward formal statehood. North of the 38th parallel, a different trajectory unfolds. With United Nations involvement rejected, Soviet-backed authorities accelerate their own state-building efforts. Political structures are consolidated around a centralized leadership. Elections are held under controlled conditions and framed as expressions of popular will within a revolutionary framework. Institutions form quickly, and power is aligned with a single political vision. Two political systems now develop openly, each claiming to represent the Korean nation. The symbolism is unmistakable. Flags are raised, anthems are introduced, official rhetoric hardens. Each side presents itself as the legitimate government of all Korea, even as practical control extends only to the line dividing them. The possibility of a negotiated reunification recedes further into the background. For ordinary Koreans, the consequences are immediate and personal. Families divided by the 38th parallel face increasing restrictions on movement. Travel becomes regulated, then discouraged. Communication grows uncertain. Political neutrality becomes harder to maintain as participation or refusal to participate acquires meaning. Silence, boycott, or engagement each carries risks. By mid-1948, the logic of division had become institutional. Elections intended to restore sovereignty instead anchor separation. What had been described as an emergency measure now defines the political landscape. Administrative boundaries turn into political realities, reinforced by law, ceremony, and enforcement. Two governments stand ready to claim authority. Independence is close, but it will not arrive as a shared moment. It will come twice, on different days, under different flags, leaving the question of unity unresolved and increasingly difficult to revisit. Independence arrives in Korea not as a shared celebration, but as two separate announcements. By the summer of 1948, the temporary structures of occupation had hardened into rival states, each claiming legitimacy, each shaped by 3 years of foreign administration, internal conflict, and narrowing political choices. What was once described as provisional has become defining. On 15th August 1948, in Seoul, the Republic of Korea was formally proclaimed. The date is chosen deliberately, marking the 3rd anniversary of liberation from Japanese rule. Ceremonies are held, speeches are delivered, and flags are raised. For many in the South, the moment carries genuine emotional weight. After decades of colonial rule and years of uncertainty, sovereignty is finally declared in Korean hands. Yet the celebration is incomplete. The new government's authority extends only as far as the boundary drawn 3 years earlier. The language of national independence sits uneasily alongside the reality of a divided peninsula. Even as officials speak of unity, the structures of governance operate within fixed limits. Less than a month later, on 9 September 1948, a separate state was declared in the north, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Its founding follows months of preparation. Ministries are already staffed, security forces are organized, economic planning is underway. Like its southern counterpart, the new northern government claims to represent all of Korea, not merely the territory it controls. The division is now formal, but it has not emerged suddenly. It is the result of cumulative decisions made since August 1945. Administrative separation, incompatible reforms, failed negotiations, and elections conducted under partial conditions. Independence does not erase these processes. It confirms them, transforming temporary arrangements into permanent institutions. Foreign forces begin planning their withdrawals, but their departures do not mean disengagement. American troops reduce their presence in the South after the establishment of the Republic of Korea, transferring responsibility to the new government while maintaining advisory roles and strategic ties. Soviet forces withdraw from the north earlier, confident that a loyal political structure and security apparatus are firmly in place. In both cases, occupation ends not with erasure, but with inheritance. The institutions left behind carry the imprint of their formative years. Police forces trained under occupation now serve national governments, bringing with them habits of surveillance and enforcement shaped by earlier priorities. Bureaucracies reflect the administrative cultures in which they were built. Political authority, once justified by occupation, is now defended in the language of national security. For ordinary Koreans, independence brings little clarity. Families remain divided by a boundary that is increasingly difficult to cross. Letters fail to arrive. Visits become impossible. What had once been a line of administration has become a barrier to everyday life. Political opponents face continued repression in both states, justified now not as temporary measures, but as necessary defenses of sovereignty. The legacy of occupation is visible in daily routines. Economic systems follow diverging paths, land redistribution, and centralized planning in the north, continuity and gradual reform in the south. Schools teach different versions of recent history. Newspapers frame the same events in opposing terms. Memory itself begins to split, shaped by borders rather than shared experience. What is striking is how little room remains for alternatives. In 1945, Korea's future appeared open, unsettled, and undecided. By late 1948, those possibilities had narrowed sharply. Each government defines itself as the only legitimate Korea, leaving little space for compromise without appearing to concede sovereignty. Division is no longer provisional. It is institutional. Yet this outcome was not inevitable from the start. The occupation years reveal a sequence of choices made under pressure by foreign powers prioritizing global strategy and by Korean leaders navigating limited, often constrained options. The line at the 38th parallel did not dictate every decision, but it shaped the environment in which decisions were made and in which possibilities were gradually foreclosed. Independence, when it comes, carries the weight of those lost possibilities. Korea is no longer under direct foreign rule, but it is not whole. The occupation has ended, but its structures remain, embedded in governance, borders, and political culture. As 1948 draws to a close, the peninsula stands divided, armed with competing claims and unresolved grievances. Liberation has delivered sovereignty, but not unity. The future, once delayed by occupation, now waits beneath the shadow of a division already proving difficult to undo. History rarely ends cleanly, and Korea's division did not begin with war, but with choices made under pressure. Like the video, share it with others interested in post-war history, and subscribe for more WW2 tales exploring the consequences of conflict. Your support helps keep these stories grounded, researched, and remembered.